Welcome to Keith and I Don't Tread on Anyone. Avoiding the root is a major logical fallacy. This occurs when the arguer critiques an arbitrary or accidental or trivial aspect of an argument in place of addressing the primary concern. So imagine if someone says, you should be forced by law to fund the Catholic Church so kids can attend the church and become more moral from their teachings and more wise. And you say, I don't believe the Catholic Church has the right to forcibly take my income. And you respond with, what do you have against education? Why are you anti-learning? Well, the person wasn't against learning or education. They were saying that a group of people doesn't have the right to force their children to attend or force them to fund something that they are against. This is very important, and it comes in many different forms. It was really exposed to me in a book, Democracy, The God That Failed, by a University of Las Vegas, Nevada professor, Hans Hoppe. He says, there were those who recognized correctly that the problem lay with monopoly, not with elites or nobility. But they were far outnumbered by those who erroneously blamed it on the elitist character of the rulers instead, and who accordingly strove to maintain the monopoly of law and law enforcement and merely replaced the king and the visible royal pomp by the people and the presumed modesty and decency of the common man. Hence, the historic success of democracy. So what is he getting at here? He's saying that the problem with governments throughout history is not that, well, there's one guy and he has a crown and he's only there because his dad was there first. And there's a lot of us who don't get a say. He's saying that the problem, that all of those things are arbitrary. They're avoiding the root problem. And the problem is that one entity, person or group of persons, had a monopoly right on how people should live their lives on a geographical area, on property they did not acquire through voluntary exchange or original appropriation. So they had no right to make rules. It's the difference between here are the rules in my apartment complex versus here are the rules in England and its colonies. Well, those people haven't contracted with you. You don't own that property justly. So this was a major failing in political philosophy. People criticized the fact that there was a king who had jewelry and they had servants and that had to go. Now, maybe that stuff is bad, but that does not get at the root of the issue. The root of the issue is the king initiated violence against peaceful people under the guise of law and legislation and funding certain endeavors without the consent of those people. Now, here is how we see throughout history a discussion of monarchy using Google Books and Graham Viewer. Now, maybe I'm not onto something here, but maybe I am. Please let me know in the comments below. The monarchy is not really talked about anymore because there's not a whole lot of monarchies. So they used to be heavily criticized in the 1800s, and then after the First World War, a lot of monarchies had gone down. So now we don't really discuss monarchy. Now, consider the term patriarchy. Here is a perfect case of avoiding the root. There is a government who claims the right to initiate violence against peaceful people under the guise of regulating them or taxing them just to fund things for the greater good. Or they start wars based on lies that kill millions of people. They cage people for victimless drug crimes and victimless prostitution engagements. Or they gamble, so they raid the place. They take half your income through civil asset forfeiture along with the income tax. And what is discussed in the American or English culture is patriarchy. There are too many men involved in this. There shouldn't be a king. There should be the people. That is literally the same thing as critiquing the crown on a person instead of the entity itself. You're saying if only women engaged in such violence. It's not violence when Hillary Clinton does it. It's not violence when the Queen of England does it. It's not violence when Golda Meir does it. Yada, yada, yada. Now, the king is hardly discussed anymore. It's hardly even brought up, so people have a new enemy. Now, what is the problem? The problem's not that we have some king. The problem is that some of these lawmakers might be motivated by racism. This is what we need to discuss. The thoughts in the mind of people engaging in mass murder, mass theft, and mass kidnapping is what we need to address. No, the problem is that that role exists in the first place. The problem is that one entity, a group of people, claim the right to rule other human beings and don't allow them to live freely. The problem with slavery is that it involves a whip, and it involves cotton picking, and it involves poor conditions, and you work long hours. Nope, those are all avoiding the root. Those are all technicalities around the fundamental principle. What's wrong with slavery? It initiates violence against peaceful people. It's one person or a group of people claiming ownership, saying they have a higher claim to your body and property and time than you do. That's the fundamental problem. So focusing on, well, the people doing this are disproportionately male. They are disproportionately white. So we need to focus all our efforts on getting women and non-whites to do these same things under a different justification. The problem is the issue at hand, initiating violence. Now, what about the elites? Ooh, the problem is that there are elites. Well, there's a lot of elite sectors. There are elite dentists, elite doctors, elite architects, elite, fashion designers. There certainly is an intellectual elite. I mean, what percentage of people sell 99% of the books? I don't know. Like J.K. Rowling, Stephen King, and Paul Krugman. I mean, they sell, what percentage of people sell the books that are read by most people who purchase English books? Very microscopic percentage. There's an elite of those who engage in food production, those who engage in product distribution, those who engage in argumentation. The problem is not elite. The problem is that some people initiate violence against others. Sexism. Oh, sexism is this terrible thing, even though historically it was much worse than it is today. Now is the time to talk about it. This is what we have to focus on. Are you a sexist? Oh, sexism. This is something that needs to be brought up today. Even though, men were drafted historically, today they still have to sign up for the draft. Men have a lower life expectancy. Men are more likely to be victims of homicide, more likely to commit suicide, more likely to be homeless. But, sexism and Gloria Steinem. Oh, are you a racist? Not just engaging in racism. Let's get into the mind of the person and focus our energies on what they're thinking. No, that also is not the problem. These are all distracted terms to avoid the root problem of our society. Some people claim the right to initiate violence. Watch out for white supremacy. Now, this is when the Klan is like the weakest it's ever been, and now it's being talked about more than ever before in literature. That's because it's a smokescreen to avoid the root so they can usher in a different ruling class with a different mask on. So you'll be like, oh, this is so different. This is not like a monarchy. This is a democracy. This is not like the democracy that was racist and sexist. This is a progressive democracy, and they have the right to rule us. And, of course, the 1%. Even though in the year 1800 and 1850, you had more smaller group of people influencing society than you do now. If you want to influence society and you're just the average person, it's probably no better time than today, or maybe 10 years ago with all the censorship. But now we're talking about the 1%. Really? Waging war on the 1% is getting at the heart of the issue. Hans Hoppe continues saying, owing to these restrictions regarding entrance into government, the exclusive status of the individual ruler and his family as king and nobles, private government ownership, monarchism, stimulates the development of a clear class consciousness on the part of the governed public and promotes opposition and resistance to any expansion of the government's power to tax. In other words, when there was a king, you knew who the king was and you knew who he ruled over. Today, with democracy, it's not necessarily that much better. Everyone says, I am the government. Really? How many laws have you made? Can you force the government to do things against their will? No, you're called a terrorist. Can government force you to do pretty much anything? Yeah, they just call it legislation after they voted on it. It's so ridiculous. We are the government. They cage you for not obeying their commands. And if they disobey your commands, well, that's just part of their position. How are you the thing that also rules you? A clear-cut distinction between the few rulers and the many ruled exists, and there is little or no risk or chance of a person moving from one class to another, confronted with an almost insurmountable barrier to upward mobility. Solidarity among the ruled, their mutual identification as actual or potential victims of government violations of property rights is strengthened. So, if you are on the alt-right and say, people need a sense of community and purpose and togetherness, I think you should be a libertarian who recognizes the state as a separate, violent, unjustified entity. And if you're a leftist who sees the ruling class or the elite, look, most likely you're in the 1% of all people on earth that doesn't give people in Haiti the right to initiate violence against you. And the ruling class's risk of losing its legitimacy as a result of increased taxation is accordingly heightened. So what is the problem? The problem is the illegitimacy of the state rests on the fact that it exercises control over resources that its agents never acquired through original appropriation or voluntary exchange, and it does so without the consent of the rightful owners of said resources. Not men are involved. Not only one person is involved. Not there's too many white people. Not that demographic is too old and out of touch. The problem is some people advocate initiating violence against peaceful people. In other words, what makes the state a unique institution is it initiates violence against people. The market, contrary to the state, relies primarily on voluntary exchange between consenting adults. Coercion, or the initiation of force or violence, is the difference between rape and making love, theft and charity, slavery and freedom, statism and voluntarism. This is something referred to as the non-aggression principle. Yes, it's that simple, meaning that offering your hand out in a voluntary exchange is morally superior to initiating violence against that person. Notice it doesn't say everything will be perfect so long as, Trump's not in office. It's saying this is morally superior. Are there going to be problems? Yes, there's also problems under statism. Is there going to be corruption? Yes, there's also corruption under statism. Will people be poor? Possibly. But people have been poor under statism going back till, Trump, Obama, the fucking pharaohs of Egypt. So blaming poverty on free markets and voluntary exchange makes you a fucking idiot. This is an idea promoted in Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, where he says there's basically two ways we can achieve our ends. There is the economic means. The economic means is when individuals or groups of people engage in voluntary exchange, mutually beneficial. And then there are the political means, which is when you force someone to do something. That's what makes government a unique institution. Imagine, Walmart voted that everyone has to give it 10% of their income and follow by Walmart's rules. So long as every 4 years you get to vote for the CEO, this is a legitimate piece of law. And it's so ridiculous. That's why government is bad. This is something also promoted in a book called The Law, written in the 1850s by Frederick Bastiat. Excuse me. Frederick Bastiat, author of The Law in the 1850s, says there's basically two ways to achieve your ends in life. There is the way of liberty, freedom, and respecting others, or there is the method of plunder. Now, it's a little sad to see since the days of Auburn Herbert, the founder of voluntarism, the word voluntarism is quite diminishing. However, the term Anarcho-Capitalism, a state without a ruling class, and the ability to do with your property as you please. More people are talking about that than ever before. Notice the spike in 1960. That's when the founder of anarcho-communism, Murray Rothbard, was sitting in his apartment with Walter Block saying, there might be 15 of us in the whole world. Now, we have full conferences and YouTube channels dedicated to the ideas. Libertarianism, a true understanding of that word, is discussed even more. And even the term voluntarism under a different spelling is talked about more than ever before. Hopefully people can stop engaging in the avoiding the root fallacy, understand that the problem is initiating violence against peaceful people, not any arbitrary or trivial technicality about what the current ruling class says, does, or is currently up to. Thank you for watching. Keith and I don't tread on anyone.